So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for showing up. And today we are going to practice having a dialectic with the subject, what is the purpose of a university in the 21st century? And the three of us are under no illusion that we are going to find an answer for that question. And that's not the point, because if we had an answer for that question, this wouldn't be a research seminar. So, as such, we were trying to inspire and trying to raise subjects of what we thought are poignant issues for the titular question. And we've subdivided those in 5 different questions, and we are going to go through those and talk to amongst those. So, my 2 lovely assistants here in the front will come and distribute a little questionnaire so that you can also provide feedback. And after we have done the questions, then we're also going to open the questions from the audience. And after that, we're going to have a little session at the Old Mare afterwards to socialize. So let's introduce the players for today. On my left-hand side, cast as academic at the later stage of his career, with accumulated experiences in doing research in Australia, India, Africa, and the UK and the United States, is Professor Keith Hollinshead. And to my right is cast in the role of middle career and Hull person is Professor r.a.barnes. And Richard is now currently acting as the faculty Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Business Law and Politics. And then we have myself, who's cast as the naive early career researcher, who is going to just ask the questions. So without further ado, can I direct the first question at you? And the first question is, what values cannot be jeopardized for a university/researchers to be considered one?
Okay, I think I'll start on this one, but before I begin, I just wanted to say a little bit about myself, because I think it's quite important in terms of understanding how we answer these questions. And I think this is ultimately because the first question is all about values, and values are, I think, very much a subjective matter. So at least if you understand who I am and where I'm coming from, at least you can perhaps see some of the biases and predispositions in terms of how I answer this question. So basic details here. My name is Richard Barnes. I'm 46 years old. I'm a legal academic by background. I was educated first at the University of Dundee in Scotland. I then went to do my master's degree at Cambridge and then my PhD in Hull. So at least I have a bit of experience of the wider university context. In terms of my career pathway, though, having completed my PhD, I took up a lectureship at the University of Hull within the law school, and pretty much all of my academic career is at the University of Hull. So I guess the point I'm probably wanting to make is that I'm a little bit institutionalized. So, and most of my views on this are perhaps dominated by how I perceive the University of Hull. Okay, so take that as you will, though. Coming back to the question of what values cannot be jeopardized for a university or a researcher to be considered one. I guess the kind of end point where I want to get to in terms of this answer is probably to say that there are maybe a smaller number of core values. The first of these, I think, is a commitment to freedom of thought and freedom of expression. I think that's quite fundamental to what universities are about and what academics are about and why they're motivated. And I think this raises some interesting questions. So kind of little anecdote here. So we have, for example, within the faculty, the Institute for Applied Ethics, and as part of the next seminar series for next academic year, we are inviting Toby Young to come and give a talk. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of Toby Young, and he's a slightly controversial speaker. He's been associated with comments on eugenics, on education, on opportunities, on sex. He tends to play his cards quite radically. Now, from my point of view, our commitment to freedom of thought and freedom of expression suggests that we ought to entertain conversations and dialogue with speakers like Toby, but at the same time, by having him come to speak at Hull, what are the kind of unforeseen consequences of a speaker like that being associated with the University of Hull? So we've got questions there about value priorities. That's the first one when we come back to it. The second one, I think, is the pursuit of truth here. I think ultimately most academics are motivated by a desire to better understand the world, to explore the unknown, to challenge existing ways of thinking, and to try and present things as honestly, as openly, as transparently as possible. Loosely kind of defined as the pursuit of truth there. But obviously, again, questions arise as to what defines that truth, what defines our capacity to answer that. And it can be quite intellectually driven, but it can also be something which is a little bit more personal. So, for example, within my role as the Associate Dean for Research, I'm engaged in a number of enterprises. One, for example, might be managing our preparations for the Research Excellence Framework. Another might be, for example, scrutinizing applications for external funding. And part of what I do is defined by my kind of integrity, and it's about challenging research and making judgment calls about what I think is good and bad. And that requires me to have kind of confidence in my ability to speak to truth, to say something is good when I see it as good, and to say something is perhaps poor, less good, when I disagree with it. So we've got that sort of set of questions there about the commitment to truth. The third thing I thought, which is quite important, is the ability to reflect on what we do. And I think this is ultimately because I take the viewpoint as an individual researcher that I'm not perfect. That might surprise some of my colleagues here, that I've got a lot to learn. I can speak with a degree of authority, but not with absolute authority in terms of my research. Equally, in terms of my role as an associate dean here, it's a bit of a learning curve. And so ultimately what I need is the capacity to reflect upon myself, to see what I'm doing, to try and put myself in the position of others, and to see myself through their eyes, and to be critical and self-reflective about what I do. Because ultimately, we are not static individuals, we are not static institutions. We need to develop and adapt, and the way forward on that is very much through a kind of reflection and learning from what we do. So that was the third point. The fourth point, I think, is very much about being a community. I think ultimately as academics, we do not live, we do not research, we do not work in a vacuum. The way in which we approach what we do is very much based upon our ability to learn from what has gone before, to be challenged by what is happening now, and to think about what differences we are making in the future. And we don't do that in isolation. We rely upon existing works, existing scholarship, to enable us, the kind of catchphrase there, we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants. We build upon existing institutions of knowledge. And so that requires us to be a community, but not just a community at a point in time, but also to be a kind of community across time. We are sharing values, ideals, approaches with other researchers across time. Anyway, those are some initial reflections, I think. So
if you are the institutionalized Hull individual, then we could summarize Hull's position as self-determination, a search for truth, the ability to self-reflect, and those three values together create the community that is Hull and that protects that community. Would there be a summary of your position presented?
Yes.
Would you add your outsider perspective and your sage wisdom to that?
I hope you can hear me. I've got a bit of a frog in the throat. Let me just do a Richard and give a bit of a background to myself, Hugh, so you know where I may be coming from and not coming from. Nothing wrong with me. I'm a northerner. Comes from Chester. I did my first degree at a little village west of here called Leeds. You've probably heard of it. I was an ancient historian then, a Romano-British historian. Loved it. Perhaps I belong a little bit more 20 centuries ago than now. Went into management studies at Loughborough, a university that is very good at being in charge of itself these days. And Loughborough often is getting in the top 5 of UK universities by some standards. Then I went to do a PhD in the US, Texas A&M, physically the biggest university in the world, and I got rather used to the American systems. My field was supposed to be what Americans were calling tourism sciences, and I was approaching it from very much a cross-disciplinary point of view. A lot of philosophy, political science, sociology, anthropology, human communications, that's the American field, marketing, history. I was looking, as Richard was talking about, questions of truth in heritage formation. So I used to project myself as a transdisciplinary researcher. But I note these days that there are lots of other definitions of transdisciplinarity that I wasn't necessarily faithful to. I mean, a lot of people regard transdisciplinarity as the marriage of academic knowledge and non-academic knowledge without necessarily relating to disciplines. So I more or less changed and became a post-disciplinary researcher. So I tend to do a lot of work on the interface between tourism and our traditional cultures from the past. How is tourism keeping lost mandates of knowledge going, if it is? And because of that, I tend to be attached to quite a few universities around the world on short visiting fellowships, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, but also in the Netherlands, where it's pretty interesting. I do a lot of work at the University of Breda, and there's lots of jealousies going on in the Netherlands over what the University of Breda is allowed to do, because it's a University of Applied Sciences, and other universities keep insisting that it still has the word applied sciences there, and therefore can't do proper research and can't have doctoral students. So it's interesting watching some of the fights that go on across Europe. Let me see. When I came back to the UK, it's not easy getting jobs back in the UK when you're abroad. I ended up at the University of Bedfordshire as a professor of public culture, the representation of people's places and pasts, all that kind of thing, that may come out in tourism and other inscriptive fields. So I was enjoying that, but in Bedfordshire, almost everything is dictated by the undergraduate enrolment. And last year it really sank, so they asked 10 professors, the oldest ones, including myself, to take voluntary redundancy. So now I'm free. I'm an independent scholar, and I can have an extra hour in bed every day. It's wonderful. So anyway, getting on to today's subject matter, I have comments to make during the day that may be philosophical, coming from a stratospheric point of view. Some may be in terms of praxis, to do with the real world. What is the real world? Whose version of the real world are we talking about? And some of them may be personal. Are the personal ones experiential or anecdotal? I mean, there's nothing wrong with the anecdotal stuff. Foucault, who I follow quite a lot, did a lot of work with anecdotal work. He was always wrong in everything he ever looked at, but we still get a lot of insight even when he was wrong. Anyway, today's topic, the future of universities. I always remember Louis Menard's comment from the US, the near impossibility of changing institutions. Is it possible easily these days to change universities quickly that are as big as universities? And the three of us were musing last night. Is there a university in the UK that in the last 10 years has significantly changed in what it offers and what it does? So in the past, I've run a lot of conferences, national, international conferences, not in the last decade. But the thing you realise that when you run a conference, national, international conference, you can change quite a few things before it starts. But once it's on, it's got its own momentum. And it's very hard to change it. And are universities like that? Do universities have their own momentum that is very difficult to control and gear up on and change?
So in terms of summarizing that, there is values that steer the conduct of universities. Those values change over time, but the implementation of those values in the codes of conduct, in appraisal standards, in whatever KPI is taken out and crystallized from those values, then creates an institutional inertia that is steering the university's development in some direction. Would that be a fair summary of?
Nobody to appeal to get the answer right. Universities can actually be anything they want to be. There is no logarithmic book that dictates what a university should be. Universities have a lot more freedom, but perhaps we don't exercise that freedom.
That relates back to the whole issue about self-determination. It's like the university is what labels itself a university, and then proceeds from that point forward.
I think it's quite an interesting question, because I mean, if you talk about self-determination here, you assume that the university or a university has the capacity to always determine what it wants and can do. Now, I think the point being, though, maybe come on to this later on, though, is that universities do not exist apart from wider social forces, and so their capacity to actually do some of these things, to set their agenda, may be necessarily limited by those other things.
Well, that's the exact social inertia that you talked about, where there's external forces. May these be from internal aspects in terms of university leadership, or maybe external in terms of, well, there's a change in student numbership, and there's only that possibility which you can do, and so forth. So, opportune moment to move to our next questions. And what lessons can we learn from the past in how a university can retain its integrity as an institution in times of rapid and technological change? And in terms of a university, the changes of how a society changes in terms of rate of change, yes, we don't have historical periods that have had the internet or that have had electricity to the same degree that we have, but we had the printing press, we had the French Revolution, we had the Second World War. There is massive changes that have taken place, and still the universities have weathered those changes. So that's what I was implying with the question of in times of radical change. So let's start with Keith for that one.
Okay. Let me see. I've just been to India, made lots of notes in India. The key thing for me is with universities is relationship building. To what degree of freedom can people who are working in universities go about the business of building relationships, and who should those relationships be? I enjoyed the freedom of being on a US campus with 50,000 students and lots of solid departments, because they were modular systems that were respected. So, at the teaching level, students were able to move around and take modular subjects from lots of other departments that they weren't part of in terms of teaching. In my experience in the UK there's a rhetoric about that, but the modularisation often in effect is not so secure, and it tends to be rather a bit more noise than actually achievable, attainable cross-fertilisation for teaching. And it may be the same in terms of research. When I was working on an American university, I found there was a lot more respect for people's individual discipline as long as you stood somewhere in relation to a discipline. You could have your own discipline, or you could be interdisciplinary. My experience, and it may be because I was at a smaller university in the UK, is that there's often a clash between what people want to achieve for the institution and what people want to encourage for individuals to do within their field or discipline. And I've found that quite a bit of a barrier.
So on top of those institutional inertia and the values that you just mentioned, there's also other more localized values or ambitions, aims that can individually be justified, but within the rubric of the greater institution of the university, they can be working counter to someone else's doing, and the individuals in and of themselves are doing quote-unquote everything right, but globally on a university level they're actually working against each other. Yeah,
where there may be silos within the university, people working individually, not necessarily being aware enough of what's going on across the campus. In the same way that in the UK, I find there's a lot more silo operations where people are working within a university and not tuned in to other universities across the UK. When I was in Australia, there were much more recognised systems that the government was funding to build in centres of excellence, which were agreed upon, and you would get 3 or 4 universities being funded to work together collaboratively. I don't find that's as common in the UK.
You, Richard, would you have something to add?
Just coming back to the question here about what we can learn from history and how we adapt to kind of particular challenges, and in particular the rate of change. I mean, in some ways this is quite a difficult question for me to answer. I mean, I'm not that old, and universities have been around for a long time. And so there's an assumption here that actually the rate of change and the kind of challenges may be qualitatively, quantitatively different, at different periods in time. I'm sure if we go back and look at, for example, universities in the 16th, 17th century, there were probably complaints from academics saying, God blimey, these printing presses are a bit radical. How are we going to keep up? How are we going to learn how to use these things and make use of them? So I suspect there are kind of memes, which transcend things across time. But kind of remarks like that aside, though, maybe 3 points I want to make on what we can learn from history. I think that the first point, and it's quite a sweeping point, is that universities, I think, as an institution, are incredibly resilient. I mean, universities have been around for centuries. So we've got the kind of, the ancient institutions which were founded in the 12th to 16th century, Oxford, Cambridge. We've got the continental universities. We've got the industrial universities which were founded in the kind of 19th century, Durham, Manchester, Victoria, so on. We've got the kind of red bricks or the civic universities, to which the University of Hull is a part of, founded in the kind of post-war years, and we've got the new universities. And actually, if you look at this, across time, as I think you, René, have pointed out here, they've survived, for example, like quite significant social, cultural, political disruption, Reformation, the Enlightenment, the the Industrial Revolution, the political revolutions in France, world wars, a conservative government of, Margaret Thatcher. They have been able to resist this. So I think that, that there's something there to say about the resilience of institutions. And I think this is largely done through a kind of capacity to adapt. I think there is something about the universities which is kind of hardwired to adapt to these kinds of challenge. The second point related to this, though, is I think that most of these drivers of change do come from outside of the university, and I think that's quite important here. It's seldom the case that the university itself sets an agenda for change and then moves forward from this. I don't think they are particularly reactive.
I would agree with you that the universities are primarily reactionary. And what is really interesting in my reading of early universities in terms of Bologna and Paris and Oxford when they got started, is that these were basically a group of learned men that formed a guild of scholars. That's where the universities come from in terms of that I'm not entirely sure about the etymology, but the term, the word university is a papal decree that was universalis. So it's the self-determination as a value which has been constant, or appears to have been constant, throughout the ages. However, the manifestation of that self-determination then takes a particular form within that environment, depending on the specific challenge that is currently occurring.
Should we drop that term university now? And I mean, the old hackneyed debate, should we be a multiversity? Should we be a pluriversity these days? Why are we still stuck with that term?
Well, there's two aspects to that. And the first one is the social as one, the community as one, but the other one is also the epistemological one of it, in a sense of like, is there one truth? Is there just one reality that we all live in? So that's a discussion, philosophical, which has been going on. But at the same time, it's the university of the institution of learned men. They can respect each other universally, even if they find different answers. I mean, the three of us just sit here. You've just come from a background of Hull and fisheries, tourism, myself geography, and we're having a conversation. We're having completely different backgrounds and coming from it, but we're still having the possibility of have this conversation within the unitary space that is a university.
What about the capacity of universities to fund themselves in ways that are not tied to central government? That was always the impressive thing for me in the US, how strong and secure their development associations were, and how many personnel were deployed in it. I mean, there was an incident when I was at Texas A&M, 2 hours up the road was the University of Texas in Austin. The head of the Development Association actually got fired because he appointed 50 new members of staff, and the president of the university was not happy about that. That was too many. But it shows you the ball game that they're in, the degree to which they are so organized in gaining funds from past students. And I was talking a bit with Richard last night, asking about how well Hull is organised in that way. Leeds is doing very well. I mean, I must get 20 to 30 communications a year from Leeds. You know, do I want to fund any money? Do I want to give anything back? I still think as universities, we can learn from what we haven't done in the past in this respect, and set up stronger development associations for gaining resources, gaining easements. We don't have to buy the thing, we can gain the use of it through a well-structured development association. What they used to do at Texas A&M was not allow anybody in the university to apply to anybody else in the corporate world without it going through this development association. Because you used to get situations where one person may be just going for $5,000 from a grant from a beneficiary and from a sponsor, and it may stop the $5 million grant coming in. So every grant application had to go through this development association, and they used to say, no, you cannot apply to this particular sponsor because we are pickling them. What do you mean pickling them? Well, they've just given 25 million last year. We're not going to approach them again for another 5 years. And it was a really studied approach how they used to get round the sponsors. They would give them football tickets, basketball tickets, the whole blooming lot, but not ask them any money for 5 or 6 years. They would pickle the sponsors. And American universities are very, very good at that kind of external fundraising that in the past I don't think we're doing well enough in this country.
The thing that I find interesting about that is that those two issues, which I mentioned earlier about like the epistemological aspect and the the community aspect, come together here. And in the sense of how they come together is, who do you get your money from matters in terms of your integrity. And I bring up your example again with the questionnaire you had when you were in Westminster, and the individual asked, where is your research funded from? And you said it was funded by the European Union. For that particular individual, that was enough to disqualify any type of thing. So it's, yes, we can play the funding game and become more lucrative in milking, lobbying past students, but there is externalities to all of these things in terms of my next question, the whole unintended consequences of, well, you can do that, but there always comes baggage with those decisions. And if you are being primarily funded by past students, well, then you're beholden to those interests of those students as well. So it's a trade-off.
I mean, just before we move on to the next question, one thing I was going to say, the issue of funding is quite important now, because obviously we're aware that universities are largely contingent on government for that, and that's in particular question just now with the Auger Review and the reduction of funding. So in a sense, you know, that contingency on funding renders universities vulnerable to external threats and challenges. And there's only limited things that universities can do to address that. One might be to expand the bases for funding of different activities. But again, that brings its own challenges. You know, if you go to the private sector, what kinds of research do you have to do in order to attract that funding? What kind of support do you have to provide to alumni associations to do that? Now, what's interesting, I think, is maybe coming back to the question of values, though, because one of the things that universities can do in order to try and resist these pressures is to have quite strong and defensible values. And if you look at individual academics, actually what defines their ability to do their job is in a sense, some of the values they have around research integrity. Because that allows them to potentially defend themselves against claims of bias, of whatever. And that's something which I think individual academics, but universities do have control over. And in some ways, what it allows them to do is to absorb these external pressures and subject it to the kind of logic of the institution, you know, by reducing these other questions down into kind of terms which they have control over. But what's interesting, I think, about this is that it sometimes predisposes universities to a higher degree of institutionalization, because in order to make those values effective, it requires you to maintain and keep structures which allow you to defend those values. And that is, I think, a particular challenge for universities going forward.
And here's also, once again, which manifests of how complex and interwoven this whole aspect is, in a sense of, you were saying structures that measure that and that reinforce that. Well, yeah, wonderful, but that's just another name, another description of what you called previously institutional inertia and all of these things. In one term, it is fulfilling the positive role, but at the same time, it is preventing something else. So how to balance those different poles as an individual? Yes, now you can balance those in terms of research integrity, but at the same time, then also it will advance your own career. You know, play the game in order to get ahead. And now suddenly, what do you do if those values, which protect the community, go counter to getting yourself ahead in that game? So now suddenly, the conduct of the individuals pursuing their own careers can create negative externalities for the people around them, even unintended.
Yeah. The value that keeps getting squashed out, or in recent history that's been squashed out, to me, is the operational value of time. Not so much the personal value, but the operational value. Too many universities that I've seen in the UK are into so much surveillance these days. Fill out your calendar, explain what you're doing, producing this immediacy to proving what your contribution is. But what that is doing is killing the longue durée. It's increasingly difficult, or in my last institution, to let projects incubate, to build up the relationship that you might need on the project. And Deleuze would call that the aspect of duration. Each project has a duration, got to be cultivated, takes time. But we have increasingly to fill out our annual plans, account for what we're doing every month, every week, every day, and it's killing that capacity to put the time in, because the understanding and trust may not be there to let the researchers, let those dealing in advocacy get on with the job. It's this lack of duration, the lack of understanding the time that things take to develop before you get the proper rewards. We're possibly cornered into demonstrating immediately what we're doing right away now and not incubating.
That's a really, really interesting point, because that also relates to an argument of size. In
Scale.
Yeah, in the sense of, if we have 10 individuals in this room, I can know everyone individually. If we have 200, 1,000, now I need those external KPIs, rules, in order to create any type of social cohesion, but that also undermines trust, because now suddenly those individuals feel like they are being controlled, they're being coerced. So it's how to fit that sweet spot of balance of where you allow those individuals self-determination, but at the same time also create the community.
I'm not sure I can answer that question. That's one which we usually throw to the floor and say, does anybody have any answers on this one? I mean, it's interesting, 'cause, I mean, we're talking about unintended consequences here, and I think it would be a brave academic to suggest that actually, you know, that the time pressures are irrelevant here. It probably is the most common refrain within universities at the moment, that actually a lot of these external changes in terms of increased student numbers, accountability, you know, KPIs and metrics is squeezed time there. And I certainly agree that's a negative, consequence of this. But at the same time, I guess, universities, again, as we've discussed, have responded to changes over time. And I think that actually that capacity for change and challenge is quite important, because it kind of creates possibilities for new ways of doing things. And I think, for example, if we go back to the kind of, the idea of the academy in the kind of 60s, where it was very much kind of insularized from, for example, other external forces, that is in itself is perhaps, difficult, because, the academics living in their ivory towers aren't exposed to the kind of same kinds of challenges and pressures that wider society are being subjected to. And so, if they're isolated from that, then their ability to engage and to communicate on the same level or against the same kind of background of concerns is challenged. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing, but actually, in terms of some of the kind of wider forces that we're seeing to do with commercialization, marketization, they are kind of extant social facts, and we cannot ignore them. And so actually, in a kind of weird sort of way, our ability, the fact that we're subjected to some of these gives us a degree of empathy, it gives us ability to kind of see how things are, and at least that might change the way in which we do our research. And it may have good consequences, may not.
But also you've hit on something here, which is role modeling, in a sense of like how you as an individual manage to integrate all of those different KPIs into your own day-to-day conduct will be a solution to creating a form out of this chaos. And if then you are advancing within your career, by definition, your solution has been given primacy. So that solution will then be sanctified within the bounds of the university and so forth. So here is where I think this is an aspect of where the individual actually has a lot more power than they realize. Because we're talking about here things like earlier, society changing, history, those society-wide changes, and now little me, what does my decision of how I do X, Y, Z matter? But the point where I come from, and the understanding that I have is the collective value of never jeopardizing those research values, which makes your research trustworthy, allows you to interact with those new KPIs in a constructive fashion.
Well, providing there is consistency there, because too often you tend to see an individual academic that is trying, they may have had an interview, an appointment, and they go into a job to work in what they want to do, but they then get given a job description that doesn't necessarily tally with that. And I've seen too much of that in the last few years, where people are appointed, but then examined every year by different criteria. And it has become increasingly exasperated in universities where there's a continual change at the dean level. We were talking a little bit about this last night. The university I was at, in the last 15 years, had 7 different deans who used to come in with great enthusiasm but impose their own eagerness and their own interests over everybody. And it's not easy if you're a researcher to change your horses in midstream. When you're reading particular journals, you've joined particular associations, you've got these long-run projects to dance to the tune of the latest change of dean. And I got a bit exasperated in my last job because there were too many changes at senior levels within the schools. But it doesn't seem to be so much of a problem here in Hull, is it?
No, not a problem. I think institutionally we have gone through considerable changes, and I think that can be very destabilizing. And I think that the particular challenge for that is one, the workload it creates, but also the way in which it kind of challenges what you might kind of call the core virtues of the academic. Your ability to be honest, open, transparent, to share, to be collegiate. And I think, certainly, come back to things like, opportunities for promotion and advancement. The idea being that if you're a good academic and you display those virtues and you're successful in kind of what you teach and research, you should be rewarded for that. But equally, if mistakes are made, or for example, there's a capacity to game that, by being really good at one thing, but not so good at other things, that undermines the community.
And here is where the whole what is the purpose becomes important, in a sense of now that you have a pool of individuals who are all individually trying to solve those contradictory KPIs or pressure that they're doing. Some will do it well, some will do it less well, and now you have the university leadership selecting individuals and promoting them through the ranks of the institution. What you've done now is you created an evolutionary selection pressure for best practice. Best practice for what? Best practice for whatever that purpose selects for. And in times of survival, in times of needing funds, that selection will be made for, well, what allows funds to come into the university. But that selection might not be conducive to what creates good research practice. So it has to be, and here we come back to the whole, is it multiple or can it be one or so? It has to be a common purpose at every level of the hierarchy. Otherwise you create those institutional pushes that are being counterproductive in and of itself.
I mean, the key word that Richard said was the word collegiate. And I've always enjoyed working best in universities where that collegiality has been promoted. And what I mean by that is, I think collegiality is a social thing. It's all to do with conviviality. And the universities I've enjoyed being in most are those where there are convivial activities that bring people together, not only within, but particularly across campus. And I mean, the best university I ever went to for it was the University of Otago. They have so many, go down to the South Island, New Zealand, at the end of the world, then turn around and come back. It's, I once did 5 presentations there. With my main one, there were 18 other functions on that particular night in the university, to do with music, to do with meetings, for this, that and the other. Those convivial structures were bringing people together and multiplying the university capacity to imagine new things. Collegiality, conviviality, very important things. How is Hull for conviviality?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
I think most recently that probably one of the best things I've done as Associate Dean for Research was to go out on a Friday night for dinner with some of my research leads, and actually, you know, the kind of rule was not to talk about research and actually just to get to know each other as colleagues. And I think, you know, that idea of building up opportunities for social interaction is important because it creates trust, it creates understanding. You can explore the kind of wider pressures which we're under, and I think that helps us kind of negate, you know, some of these external concerns we've got.
On top of all of that, in terms of like community building, but just in and of itself for the subject of research, there is this one like thing that I remember. I can't remember where I heard it from, but it was some like university that had a lot of Nobel Prizes, and they attributed it to that the different faculties had a common coffee room. And I find that in my own job role, in a sense of like, I am working with academics in terms of allied health, all the way to English and social science in between. And yes, these are all vastly different subjects, but I can take ideas from those and tell them to the musician or tell them to the historian. Because the mode of communication, you are communicating with human beings. And there's similarities that can be learned by, and the other aspect as well is, there is inspiration of putting your own problem in a different context and getting someone else's previous experiences with something similar. And then that is created within that community and is generating aspects which were not previously thought of, coming back to the word that I said yesterday, fecund, in a sense of, that is the not the goal, but a good externality that a functional community has created, that it can generate stuff.
Yeah, the University of Loughborough is very good at that. In the design of the place, Loughborough has a lot of little small bars where you can have a coffee, a beer, a cider at any time of the day, and somebody just appears from behind. One person is manning the thing, but it gives opportunity to keep meeting other people and add mixing, and where and I was talking last night, a similar thing in the US. In the US, I never used to have many appointments with my doctoral students because I used to see them all the time in little coffee sessions. You didn't need the big appointment. I find in England I've got to make the appointment with the doctoral student to get them to come on campus because they're not having any other convivial, collegial moments. Whereas in the US, I didn't have to have those appointments because it was 2 minutes in the corridor, 3 minutes over coffee, 5 minutes. Those social, convivial, multiplier activities are really, really good.
I think this is an absolute perfect note to open up for questions, if there are any questions from the audience.
Is the audience still there? They're very quiet.
All we can see is the dark.
There is a microphone. There's a microphone here, and if you could speak in that would be perfect.
I think it's, well, I've got a comment about it is really important where research funding comes from because it determines who your customer is. So in the UK, we fund nationally under the Haldane principle. So researchers decide where government funding goes. So I've been funded by the US Navy, a cancer charity, and venture capitalists. And it does change the research you do, it has to. So just a point that I think it is really, really important. And we could do better at getting alumni to fund research and other activities at the university, but being very cautious about what consequences that would have. But another point, maybe I misunderstood, but one thing you said the purpose of the university was by having 3 wise men having discussions and agreeing. You can do that down the pub. So there's often 3 wise men or 3 wise women having a conversation down the pub, and with respect. So, but there is funding required, and time does cost money. And so thinking about really who are the customers of that thinking time is important. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about how the changing face of who the customers for research and for other activities, knowledge exchange, are within the HE sector in the UK and in different places.
You want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Maggie. I agree with your first point as well about funding. Actually, you know, some of the research I've done is for NGOs or government departments, and actually I think I'm a better researcher by having done different types of research for different people because it gives me a greater awareness of what my research can actually achieve. But actually, at the end of the day, I would like to think that I'm not just researching for the academic sake. I'm actually researching to make a difference to society. And so I think it's important to sort of tune into that. And I think also in terms of the kind of other avenues for funding, so we could talk about knowledge transfer partnerships, we can talk about all the different kind of funding agencies. And I think regardless of whether or not we get these, I think the fact is that being exposed to these pressures to make us reflect upon actually what we're doing and why we're doing it is incredibly important. You know, again, it's the idea that universities do not exist apart from kind of wider society there. I mean, I think throughout the history of universities, they've probably been created for or been enabled by kind of, you know, sort of different things. So, you know, part of it's to respond to, you know, post-industrialization, you know, sort of the growth of the universities in the 60s and the 70s to kind of emancipate to upskill labor markets, to kind of respond to a kind of social function. So again, I think we need those external forces because it kind of challenges us, and it kind of drives what we do. I think the challenge is internally, how do we respond to that, and how do respond to the kind of pressures and the difficulties of meeting these new agendas.
I would elaborate further in terms of coming back to the example that I had earlier about where universities come from, and like those really, really early universities that were guilds of learned men. The way that they used teaching was to just fund themselves. So the teaching function with what accumulated the resources for them to just go after their own passions. And those individuals which they were teaching in whatever that was, in logic and mathematics or whatever, they that would then go on and fulfill bureaucratic functions of society. They would become tax collectors, they would become whatever. So the university became a function within a state, within society, in terms of what you were into, like changes of adjusting to post-industrial changes and so forth. So maybe the fundamental technological change and information change has now also created another role for university where there is no longer enough to just teach, to just advance knowledge. It's now also be able to discern what is accepted types of knowledge and what is not accepted type of knowledge. This is the whole Foucault things in terms of like, it's not right or wrong, true or false. It is more, this is scientific, where we can answer those questions, and this is not scientific. So by that, creating the entire space, like we have here, this space for discussion, which then allows, oh, this is the medium where we solve problems in, and everything else doesn't have legitimacy to it.
Yeah, that technology question is really important. What I've seen on several university campuses in this country is the overmastery of the logos of technique. We have to be technological. We've got to update everything. We've got to operate the best technological systems to communicate what courses we have available, what programs of study. And I find too much time is spent in the UK updating last year's technological delivery to be spick and span in the best possible way. Whereas in the US, those pressures tend not to be there so much because there isn't so much external evaluation. US universities don't have the same degree of external surveillance. So it is so often left for the given professor to dictate whatever else he or she wants to offer in the given subject. But in the UK, we have so much surveillance over what is offered and so much updating of it technologically each year that we can't relax on the subject. We're always forever administratively changing it. I find that a bit disempowering in the UK.
Can I ask one quick follow-up question from that then? So do you think that the private sector that's moving in will solve it all and give space for people to think and to do research on their own terms, funded through student fees?
Well,
Are the new private universities going to encourage more thinking time?
there's a whole heap of positives there and a whole nest of vipers bringing in the private sector.
Expected a big gasp then.
But I think it's a fair point though, Mike, because if you look at the new universities in the private sector, they're much more efficient. They tend not to be kind of research factories, do they? So actually, there is a risk there from that kind of model, which might actually squeeze out even further what we're doing, because we have to then compete with them in terms of student recruitment, in terms of sort of student satisfaction. And that comes through sort of more teaching and so on. So I think we have to be sensitive to it.
Rudy.
Everyone said in the first two rows. Okay, it wouldn't keep you busy then, if we did this. I wonder, from what's been said, to what degree the question should be slightly altered to, I see there are two dimensions. One is obviously a time dimension, and universities change over time. And another one is, and that's because I'm possibly a comparative politics person, is the country dimension. It strikes me there are very different models, even within Europe, where you'd have a Bologna process, which wasn't going down very well in several European countries. There's still very different ones, and your r.a.barnes example I thought was a very interesting one. So applied sciences in the Netherlands gets PhD students. In Germany it's exactly the other way around. So University of Applied Sciences, which are the former polytechnics, are not allowed to have PhD students. So they have to have their doctorate students from a, in quotation marks, proper university supervisor, and they don't have that. So are we not actually talking about universities changing over time and within countries, and then obviously also under different governments there are different pressures. So if there is a change of, for universities the change is slower than, let's say, for the primary education sector, where it changes an awful lot. So if we were talking about schools, you'd have a new curriculum, a new government, at least in the UK, which is not the case in some other countries. So I wonder whether, when we discuss this, whether there are particular pressures in the UK, which I think there are, that are very peculiar to the UK, and they're particularly intense at the moment, from funding and orga review and so on. And then there are some genuine pressures and some genuine sort of changes that happen to the university sector across countries, and that are quite similar, but there are also important differences, I think.
You want to start, Keith?
Perhaps it will be solved with Brexit.
No, but I agree with you that there is a stark difference in different countries, and every country has their own particular tradition and so forth. But at the same time, there is some commonality in terms of universities and what types of things they're facing. And one of the examples of how that is the whole understanding of publish or perish is universal. Like, yes, the specific KPIs of what you're getting is so, but
Can I just come in on this one? I have a colleague who used to be in the biology department, and he moved to Bayreuth in Germany, and they don't, I find it wrong, but they don't care how many students they have. In fact, they're quite happy if they don't have many students. They go, well, let's work. So it's a totally different context for him to work in Bayreuth than he used to work in Hull. And that's 5 years difference and 500 kilometers, difference.
But it's a different country.
Perhaps we should ask Nigel Thrift about the international factors. He had this concept of the necklace university, where he was recommending that universities should find partner universities around the world that relate in the same subject area, the same value setups, and they are necklaced. There's a string of beads around the university. Perhaps somebody like Nigel Thrift at Warwick would have rich experience about the different national flavours, the national difficulties that university faces.
I think it's an interesting point that you raised there, Rudy. Kind of stepping back a little bit, because I'm thinking, what's the purpose of a university? And actually a lot of the discussion's been on like what kind of some of the potential solutions are and how do we respond to these kind of changes. But going back a step further, it's like, well, what is the problem with universities? Because that assumes there's a need to intervene or to look for solutions. So one is, going out to the market and to try and privatize and subject universities to these kind of pressures to kind of change the way they operate, the assumption being that somehow they've been lagging behind. Now, I mean, it's not my area of experience, but I'm aware that, for example, some of the reports which have been conducted into universities have tended to suggest that the universities within the UK have generally been a bit resistant to change, and they haven't kind of kept up with these wider social forces, and in a way that kind of justifies some of the interventions. Now, coming back to the point about, are there kind of problems which kind of transcend or run across different countries? I mean, challenge-led research seems to be quite a big meme, but also accountability for research performance seems to be a kind of cross-cutting theme. And so, for example, the research assessment exercise, the REF, what we're looking at here are kind of different mechanisms of intervention being used to try and hold universities to account for what they may be doing rightly or wrongly. But actually, these kind of mechanisms are being transplanted from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. So we're seeing these being rolled out in Australia, in New Zealand. I think the concern I would have is that actually the assumption is that one kind of solution, i.e. REF or KEF, is being applied without a sufficient sensitivity to context, and that ignores maybe the different cultural traditions, background traditions, as you said within Germany, the publishing traditions, and I think we have to think a little bit more carefully about where we draw these solutions in and how they impact upon individual institutions, because what Hull does is very different from what Manchester does, which is very different from what Harvard or the Delft does. But this idea of imposing top-down solutions is always challenging.
But that comes back to the mission statement that is in line with those different pressures, and then we come to your point of where that mission statement keeps changing, and then how reflected is any of those overarching missions with the individual aims of the academics in one particular discipline. And now here we are, and all of those individuals have to be able to work together.
And then judged in terms only of metrics.
So that's what I would say is the articulation of the problem.
I mean, can I just clarify? I wasn't wanting to suggest that every university is different in every country. There are, some genuine pressures, and Richard, you're quite right. There are some very similar types of, challenges for universities across the world. But there are also some that are genuine to either a particular country or group of countries that are very different, and sometimes they become more apparent at a certain period of time, and some other universities will follow 10 years later that trend. Some will never go down that route, and I think it's important to see that there are differences, because obviously when you look at what's the purpose of a university in the 21st century, I think there are slightly different models in different countries, or at least in different time periods in those countries as well. So the country dimension does make a difference, I think.
Of course, I'm not disagreeing, but the benefit you get from the whole asking the question of what is the purpose of the university, that puts the agency back in your place, where you are being dictated by all of these KPIs that are coming externally, but now you are the individual that is asking the question. Well, okay, KPI A, B, C, D, what are they good for? What are they good for me? What is my purpose? And then coming back to this whole evolutionary mechanism of finding best practice and so forth, where different individuals within your community try different approaches, and then they're talking to each other and comparing notes, sharing best practice. But that comes back together of what is that overarching goal, aim, where we're going towards?
In relation to that, the creativity angle is one that I would like to see more universities explore. What do I mean by that? When I was at Texas A&M kept promoting itself as a world university, and it was looking for other campuses around the world where it could send its students and federate in various ways. I've always thought there's a lot of scope for UK universities in playing ball with American universities, particularly in the summertime as an income-raising thing, when there are so many North American students who are looking places to land in the summer and do mini little courses, mini little places. And I was trying to get Bedfordshire to make itself available for several such campuses in North America, where the university might provide in the UK a common library, common teaching areas, but the development would be paid for by the American universities who are chasing this world status. So I'm very keen to see universities, I'd call it the angle of compossibility. What are the future possibilities? Working with other universities, other institutions that need us, because we're in Europe, and with the history of Europe that people in the other parts of the world want to see. So we can make available our campuses at times when they're light in use, by federating with arrangements with those other universities that claim to want to be world universities. I'm not saying that Hull should project itself as a world university, but I am suggesting there are possibilities in universities in this country prostrating themselves a little bit for those universities that may have the funds to be able to play a senior role in such developments.
So maybe we should have the last question connecting on that, and also to round up the session. What competitive advantage, what positive thing is there about Hull within that entire new ecosystem that we can leverage and utilize in order to address some of the problems that we have mentioned? You mentioned yesterday something about Hull's position of it, the isolation being also an advantage in some dimension.
Well, every university has a geographic advantages, and every university has weaknesses. I used to get so annoyed in Bedfordshire because when I was there, they were just seeing Bedfordshire as the University of Bedfordshire. And I was trying to say, well, look, wait a minute. Bedfordshire is 30 minutes north of London by the train, easy to reach, so you can tie London in. It's midway between Oxford and Cambridge, so you link in, you can run Oxford and Cambridge as part of the appeal of Bedfordshire if you've got the imaginative thinking. Now, might be a little bit harder in Hull because of its extreme position on the coast, but every place has advantages. Can I ask, to what degree is the University of Hull a Hanseatic institution? Is it federated with the other universities that are in the other Hanseatic places?
Not to my knowledge.
Could it?
No, I mean, we're a member of different consortia, so the GU8, so similar coastal universities. So there are these networks around which we're part of.
But does it buy into the Hull's history? The Hanseatic history?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So I think what you're trying to touch on is the whole like identity building and creating a common heritage and taking that tradition further and creating values that are in line with that tradition that takes it further.
Yeah. And not closing them down. See, I used to work at Leeds Met. What a silly thing. You've got Leeds University, and next door they call university Leeds Metropolitan University. How the hell can you get distinct identity? You've got barriers that way, only in the name. I wanted it to be called Brigantia University. There was more scope for Leeds Met. Now they have changed their name. Now it's Leeds Beckett. Problem is nobody knows who Beckett was. So what's in a name? Are we strong enough in cultivating creative thought about what we are and what we could be? Are there other geographic, history, heritage resources that we're too busy with the day-to-day minutiae to think about?
I think the question of identity is quite important. I mean, it's generally sort of seen to be twofold, because one is identify who with. So it's the kind of shared heritage and history that you're talking about. And I think there is quite an extensive amount of kind of shared practices, sometimes not always at the university level. And I think actually a lot of the stronger partnerships tend to be at disciplinary or research-based levels. And it's a matter of kind of capturing those. There's then the kind of the other idea of identity being something which identifies you as an individual, and so it's the sense that the university has to have an identity which distinguishes it from the group. So whereas one is the kind of common practices and shared histories and things which bring people together, shared languages, the other one is saying something different. And that's equally important because that gives you that competitive edge. Now, I did wonder about whether competitive is a good way to describe this, but I do think, because universities are grounded in the real world and they have to compete for students, research, grants, they have to be able to say something about what they do well. Now, you gave some examples here about whether it's maritime, whether it's energy and environment, whether it's slavery and emancipation. These are all things which we could be distinctive about. But I think more fundamentally, though, is that we have to know what we're good at and to continue to revisit that question about knowing what we're good at and saying what we're good at over time. Because the agenda will change, but that commitment to kind of reflective focus on what we're doing, I think is really, really important for that purpose.
So on that note, I thank you very much for your time and listening to us, and I thank the panel for discussing those ideas, and I would like to welcome everybody to follow me to the pub and discuss the strategic aim of which we shall defend over time and go for. So thank you very much for everything, and